This is Henry Chamberlain, and it's going to be a fun interview. I am all set. I got my book here, American Comics, A History by Jeremy Dauber. And we're going to be talking with Jeremy Dauber about this book. And to begin with, thank you so much for doing this interview, Jeremy.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I wanted to begin by I go into all these different tangents and I have to corral them in. One thing that I thought might be fun to just mention briefly was my review. I thought it was kind of clever to say that I find a book to be like a choose your own adventure kind of book. At least that's my experience. I think it'll be for a lot of people because there's so much. I mean, comics is so broad and people have their own niche favorite topics and themes to pursue. So would you agree that this book allows for people to jump in different areas, to jump in chapter 8, chapter 7?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right. That on the one hand, one of the things I tried to do in writing the book was say, here's this story that kind of develops through history, and people sort of in the story are reacting to sort of the history of this medium in America, and so they make their decisions that way. On the other hand, everybody has their own connections to comics. Everybody really comes into it from a different place. Everyone has their own wonderful interests in particular. And so, if people want to start there and kind of then move backwards and forward, so to speak, I think that's great too. And I hope people enjoy it that way as well.
And in the spirit of younger readers, my next question is about manga. Now, I've talked to a few academics and they go, oh yeah, the kids, they loved manga. Some people act like it's this other thing that they can't quite get the handle on. However, the big however here is, and I know you'll totally agree, is that that's an excellent place to focus in on because it's such a huge art form, and you speak about it so eloquently in your book. And some of the biggest talents in comics were influenced by manga. Art Spiegelman, Frank Miller. I'll give you the floor, sir.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. One of the real focus of the book is this story of comics in America, right? This American sort of comic story. But America is not in isolation, obviously. And as you were pointing out, so much of the story is about the way that sort of these American talents learn both from sort of, let's say, the national tradition and from other national traditions and international traditions as well. And manga is an incredibly important part of that. As I say sort of in the book, it's interesting because manga itself is influenced by an American tradition, right? I mean, Walt Disney is very important in the development of sort of what we now think of as manga. And then that comes back, Tezuka's work and others comes back and really then influences, as you say, people like Spiegelman, people like Frank Miller, absolutely. And then slowly but surely, one of the stories I tell is the way that manga becomes more and more prominent in sort of American comic book reading habits. When Frank Miller originally is influenced by manga, there's so little of it available in English translation that really he has these comments in interviews saying, something like, I read 100 pages of manga. I didn't understand a word of it, but I could tell what the story was because, it was so wonderfully laid out. There becomes sort of over the 80s, the 90s, these sort of fan-led efforts to try and sort of provide manga-related material in English, and then finally, really the floodgates open 21st century. And as you say now, it's very hard to talk about American comic book readers' habits without talking about reading manga. My focus really was on material that was primarily stuff that was produced in the United States rather than coming in. But you can't talk the story without talking about this stuff.
I'm going to be jumping, make your head spin. I'm going to be jumping from different subjects, but it all fits together, of course. I'm intrigued by, and maybe this is my problem, you can help correct me on this. I say it facetiously, but the inclusion of cartoons with comics, those at first blush, even at second blush, they're separate worlds, and yet I see how useful it is to have them included. And I say this because I have this insider information that Columbia University, their collection is cartoons and comics. So it's a very useful thing, but they are separate worlds too. Can you speak to that?
I think it's a great question, and one of the things that I sort of put right up front at the very beginning of the book is how vexed a definition of what it is this project that we're talking about is. What exactly comics are, what is in it, what isn't in it. And I, I mean, and maybe it's funny for an academic, but I've never been as fussed, let's say, as some other people about sort of what the precise boundaries of definitions are. I'm sort of more of a kind of bottom up, user focused kind of a sense of a definition of this. So, something that clearly people who are looking at, who are comics creators are looking at, are including in part of their mental map of the stuff that they care about in making comics. In some ways, that was more important to me than a taxonomical definition. I agree with you entirely that there are these real edge cases where you say sort of a single panel cartoon, how does this fit in with the way we normally talk about comics, which are these sequential images and things like that? I'm willing, let's say, to leave this as a fruitful question rather than come down hard on a particular answer. And as you say, I think quite correctly, the Columbia University title of the collection does the same thing. It just sort of says, here we are, we're putting it together, we're having a good time with it.
Yeah, well, it's very useful. And I want to jump now over to the Cold War, because I think that's like a great point of departure in talking about trying to find a definition of American comics. And as you do in your book, in so many ways, you're talking about culture, you're talking about politics. Well, the Cold War, how does that seep into comics, and how are comics used as a tool of propaganda by the State Department? What would you like to say about that?
Well, I think that, one of the things that was the most fun to try to think through in telling the story that's in the book is the way in which we think about politics, right? And you can think about it in very explicit ways and in more implicit ways as well, right? Which is often the way we do it. So, there is a tremendous amount, as you're saying, particularly, although not by no means solely in the Cold War period, of explicit political sort of rhetoric and action in the comics. Sometimes, as you say, it can be used by the State Department. You can put out comics in order to try and sort of spread sort of democratic messages or pro-American messages to different countries. But even more sort of straightforwardly than that, or more close to home, maybe I should say, than that, you have things where, like, the early Marvel comics are all very Manichaean in this kind of way of saying, who are the bad guys? The communists. Who are the superheroes? They're on the side of America and they're fighting against the communists. They're cold warriors. In many different kinds of ways, right? And it's sort of very straightforward in that kind of way. It also is interesting, where you can get to sort of these more subtle definitions of politics that aren't affiliated with these kind of national movements, of saying things like, for example, in the Cold War, romance comics are political. They're a Cold War phenomenon that really occurs sort of in the late 40s, the very early 50s. And they're a phenomenon that really advocates for kind of white picket fence nuclear family model, a heterosexual sort of male dominated family model. That is a political statement that these comics are making, even if we don't think of that explicitly in the same way as we do saying, we have to beat the communists in Vietnam, and therefore Tony Stark is going to develop some weaponry or something like that.
Now, I have periphery questions going on. I think I should insert it here. Can you share with us a little bit about your interest in comics and how it became an academic pursuit?
Sure. I'm very happy to do that. I mean, my interests in comics really date back to as long as I can remember. I was, before anything else, before I was a professor, I was a fan. I mean, I was just an enormous fan of comics all through my childhood. Mostly at that point, superhero comics, a little bit of comic strips that were in the Sunday Funnies and things like that, but mostly superhero comics. And for quite a long time, I was a Marvel zombie. I really would collect, when I was growing up, sort of everything that Marvel literally would put out. And I was very lucky to have an uncle who did not throw his comics out and really had this amazing collection of Silver Age DC and Marvel comics, and bizarrely allowed his small nephews to read them, even though we tried our best to be on good behavior with them, but I think we failed sometimes. And then as I got a little older and was beginning to think this is, as I was becoming a teenager, maybe I'm getting a little tired of this stuff. Maybe it's a little juvenile. That was precisely, this is sometimes they call it this miracle year of 1986, when Dark Knight comes out, when Watchmen comes out, and I come from a strong Jewish background, when Maus is really released as a book, and the combination of those three. This is cliched, but it is what happened biographically. Really sort of said, hey, this is really something else. And then I went to college. I went to graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, that was around the time when Vertigo was really hitting its peak. And again, sort of making this sort of a wonderful corpus for a comparative literature person like myself. And then ultimately I came to Columbia and I said, you know what? I think that there's something in this that I can discuss kind of both as a material for a course, which I've been lucky enough for the last 10 years or so to teach here and team teach with Paul Levitz, who I'm sure is a name that is well familiar to the people who are listening to this, and then to write a book about it.
Well, you're in Generation X. I'm a little bit old. I'm like the first wave of Generation X. I'm old enough, of course you are too, to remember where Generation X comes from the novel by Douglas Copeland. Right. And so a lot of what you're saying really resonates with me. I have another question I want to ask, so we can come back to that. My next question, which I think we really should cover, is superheroes in general, and how there's always been a pushback since Superman, either competing publishers coming up with their answer to Superman, or independent artists coming up with their version. Can you talk to that desire to reinvent the superhero just as it's being invented?
Right. Well, absolutely. And I think, this gets to so many important aspects, as you're sort of saying, of the story of comics, right? One of which is that, of course, in a lot of ways, not in every way, but in a lot of ways, this is the story of a commercial medium, right? And so you have, this thing that has its ancestors in a variety of different ways that I talk about in the book, but in some ways really sort of bursts like this bombshell onto sort of the commercial public, the Superman just being a huge phenomenon. And so, of course, the natural instinct in a business world is we've got to get on this. We want to produce our own thing. We want to be part of this gold rush here. There's an old saying is, right, in Hollywood, I think this is true in a lot of mass media, nobody wants to be first, but everybody wants to be second. Here, everybody certainly wanted to be second, and you have a lot of this. And not surprisingly, DC, let's call it DC, really national, really came back and sort of said, we're going to put it in suits. We're going to sue to try and get this Wonder Man business out. We're going to sue Captain Marvel. We're going to sue Shazam. We're going to try and knock them out of business because we don't want any competition. So that's one side of the story, and that's really because imitation being sort of the highest form of flattery. There's another kind of sort of thinking about the superheroes too, and this begins actually quite early on, right? Of saying, are there aspects of the superhero, this enormously successful phenomenon, that we find either mockable, right, that we can satirize, or that we find morally problematic in one way or another, or disturbing? This is the first of these is a trajectory that starts with Inferior Man and Super Duper Man and Mad Magazine and all these kind of little humor sort of takes on it, and really, of course, continues through a lot of the more comic things up to Garth Ennis's The Boys, to the present day. But then there's this other track, of course, which on the one hand we see we associate the most with the kind of Frederick Wortham 1950s Cold War attack on superheroes as causing juvenile delinquency, but in its own way also appears in so much of that dark age material from the 80s, the 90s, and what have you, of saying, is there something that's a little scary about the superhero, about the character who is sort of predisposed towards conflict, who is not interested in due process, who thinks that the answer to everything is to go and punch things, and that was something that in the 1950s, the 1960s, under the age of the Comics Code Authority, nobody really cared about. But as it became a sort of mature medium, back again, a lot of people sort of took a look at these questions of superheroes and have tried in many ways, in one way or another, to come to a different solution how to square that circle. So I think that's also a very interesting process that I talk about in the book, and that we see historically.
Well, it's just so much fun listening to you because I know you're so enthusiastic, and so it's just such a delightful topic for so many folks to talk about comics. And I wanted to bring in another question I had was about the whole idea that comics are just for kids. And then forever you heard, oh, comics are no longer for kids. But as you point out so many different ways in the book, there's always been that duality, comics for kids, but they've always been for adults as well. I think of a great example, Will Eisner in The Spirit. That's very sophisticated, very appealing to adults.
I think that's right. And one of the things that I really wanted to start the story really with comic strips in a fundamental way was not only because so much of that early comic book material was, came out of and was birthed out of this medium of comic strips. I mean, Siegel and Schuster, that their dream was to have a comic strip of Superman, right? The comic book was kind of a plan B for them, right? But also because it really reminds the readers, or I hope it reminds the readers, how much of an adult medium comics was. It was also a kids medium. You're 100. I'm not saying that that's not, but it was also an adult medium. Presidents and congressmen and Supreme Court justices and everyday working folks. Everybody was reading these comic strips. So to say, you could make these divisions of the format in which they appeared and the particular topic. But if you said, is comics something for all Americans? It would have been hard to dispute that proposition for the first five decades or so, by certainly maybe even the first 8 or 9 decades of the 20th century. Everybody was picking up their newspapers and reading these comic strips. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to do. And as you say, some of these things are really aimed at kids all along, and that continues in all sorts of different ways. But those of us who grew up in the 80s, the 90s, and are looking particularly with our love of superhero comics, are saying, well, is there a space for kids left in this? And you end up sort of seeing these sort of strange phenomena where sometimes the superhero companies, DC and Marvel, are saying, we want to make sure we're still in the kids business. We're going to partner with another company to kind of make sure that we have some kids comics. We're going to create that, which would have been, even for when we were growing up, that would have been almost an impossible sentence to kind of process. We have to make sure we're still in the kids business. So it's very interesting. And the last thing I'll say, of course, is that if we talk again about the medium as a whole, the question of are there comics for kids is also sort of a nonsensical or not a question when you have people like Dav Pilkey and Raina Telgemeier and so many others who are producing amazing high quality comics for kids that are being read in millions of copies and are available in schools, in bookstores, in libraries, again in a way that you and I would have been very delighted perhaps, but quite surprised to find when we were little kids.
It's tempting to go off into tangents, but I'll stick to my script a little bit more here. Can you talk about the Hernandez brothers and the independent spirit? Because Hernandez brothers might even be new to some of the youngest readers.
I think that's very possible, and I'm delighted to talk about them. I think that one of the things that the Hernandez brothers were these 3 brothers, although really we think mostly about work done by 2 of them, who are from California, come from a Hispanic background, and who are best known, I think it's certainly fair to say, for a long-running series called Love and Rockets, which is roughly speaking divided into sort of a more realistic sort of set of adventures of particularly some women who live in a town that's kind of modeled on Oxnard, where the Hernandez brothers grew up, and a sort of more magical realist kind of setting in a place called Palomar, which is south of the United States. So you have this, and one of the things that I loved is sort of reading back some of these books, reading these books, and also sort of reading about the Hernandez brothers, is again how much they were. Their story is about soaking up so many different influences from the generations that came before in a wide variety of ways. They're generally thought of, and I think quite rightly, as really being some of the leading voices in this kind of independent and alternative kind of movement. They're not publishing basically with DC or with Marvel. They're publishing with Fantagraphics and other places, but they love Archie comics. Anyone who looks at Jaime's work, you see down to Carlo right there. They love EC comics. They love, there was a reason why they love science fiction comics. There was a reason why there was rockets in the Love and Rockets title, right? And there's the romance, but the enormity of their talents, I think, and they are just enormous talents, really also comes from the depth of character that they invest in the work, the complicated milieus that they sort of put together, and sort of this very lovely use of language. And by that I mean not only verbal language that the characters speak, but the visual language sort of these characters and these worlds that are in it. And both of them blend reality and fantasy in their own particular weightings. But if there are people who are here who have not checked out Love and Rockets, I strongly urge you to do so. It really is a masterpiece of the medium, and Fantagraphics has done, I think, a very, very good job of not just releasing sort of these massive volumes of sort of the locus, but also sort of very particular kind of volumes. And I talk a little bit about that, which ones, so to speak, in the book.
And keeping with the theme of independent cartoonists, and actually, I guess every cartoonist is independent until he becomes a part of something bigger. The whole idea of creator-owned work, that's something that Image embraces, and it goes further back than that. And I don't know if this is a question or an observation, but book publishers are trying to get more into graphic novels, and they've experimented with one or two here and there. And I've observed that they might still need some more researching or experimenting to get it all figured out, because I think sometimes they think of graphic novels as they do books, and in the contracts the contracts are more geared to books, that they don't think about maybe even considered ending the run of ownership. They're thinking too much of their own rights, and I think it makes sense that maybe you limit the term of a contract, but for a typical book contract, it just goes on until, as long as the book's available, which brings to mind Watchmen, for instance. Alan Moore technically owns Watchmen, but as long as it's available, he doesn't really own it.
Right. And I think that, what's interesting is that the Watchmen story, I think, is a really good story, writ large, or abstracted away, of the way in which changing technologies, changing cultural mores, changing institutions really change everyone's expectations. Moore and Gibbons really assumed, and this was a perfectly natural assumption to assume, that eventually this comic would go out of print, because that's what comics did in 1986. You published them, they were out there for a while, maybe you sort of re-released them a little bit, but then eventually it went out of print. But that was precisely the time when this idea of books of comics really started for the first time to become available, and therefore they could stay in print within these covers on the shelves of bookstores forever. Right. So, everybody is sort of, we can talk about sort of the moral questions, but just in terms of the thought processes that go into it, it would be sort of like, I mean, we find now, for example, that all these contracts that are written, let's say, before the age of the internet, who would have thought to put in internet rights if you never heard of such an idea that these things were going to go on, right? So everything has to be, people are getting smarter about the idea that there are going to be subsequent platforms of which we know not. But for in general, this is very frequently the kind of thing which happened. So I think you're right to say that there's this real change in the business arrangements. And one of the stories that I tell, in the book, is how the undergrounds, this countercultural undergrounds, who are, they are obviously, they're very path breaking in terms of the content, in terms of the politics, in terms of all these kind of things. But they're also quite important, maybe even more important, perhaps, in sort of saying, we remember those comic strip syndicates where the comic cartoonists, they got ownership. They shared it with the syndicates, but they got ownership. And we want to try and make sure that we have these business arrangements, try and figure out some way of doing that ourselves. And that story begins slowly but inevitably to seep into, as you say, into sort of the mainstream, and ends up in sort of the very much more robust kind of creator-owned model that we have now, which flourishes side by side with, playing with the company toys, as Paul Levitt sometimes puts it. Right? You're going to play with Superman, and there's certain things you have to give up, but you have to play with Superman, so there's that.
I have just a few more questions, but more like we just have to cover this a little bit, maybe a few words on the elephant in the room, Marvel. And what I find, from my point of view, I mean, at some point, like, okay, I don't know if I can keep up with all these movies, but what is so distinctive to me, what is so amazing, is that the Marvel Universe phenomena was the first time that you had a quality motion picture that was delving into what a more or less what the actual contents of a comic book beyond the origin stories, because we kept being given origin stories and we never seemed to move much further than that.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, one of the things that there would be another Batman or another Superman movie, and I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to go, but like I have to sit for the first 25 minutes, which is going to be that same story, that same origin story all over again, and who really needs that? But you're 100% right that, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Kevin Feige, and all of the people who work with him, just a tremendously incredible and admirable achievement of saying, we're not going to be afraid. In fact, we're going to be the opposite of embracing this complexity, this continuity, movies that really rely on other movies or other TV shows in order to have sort of significant plot points kind of develop. We're going to have this sort of, this sense of one of the things that many of us who love the Marvel Universe think about as part of the essential nature of what this experience to be in the Marvel Universe is. And I don't actually think, I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think that there's another endeavor like this in the history of the film medium, of something to have this brace of pictures that's all clear. Now, one of the things that helps a tremendous amount with that, I think it's fair to say, is the development of streaming and having a platform you can say, oh, I can, on Disney Plus, if I want to catch up, I can catch up on all the movies I want, and they're very nicely laid out in order. And also, I can have these sort of hub and spoke models where I can have these television shows or these smaller things that come off, and that allow for a much wider diversity of style and experimentation. There is no way there could have been, for example, in my opinion, at least, it would have been very hard, at least, to have made a WandaVision movie.
Yeah.
I just don't think that would have been. I don't think anyone would have passed on that. Or everyone would have passed on that. I don't think anyone would have accepted it. And yet, I think that having the freedom to put this on Disney Plus and say, you know what, if people didn't like that one, there's another one coming out in 3 weeks. It says we're going to take a chance. And for me, it was an enormous, aesthetic achievement. I thought that I really enjoyed WandaVision quite a lot and thought it had a lot to say about various different things. And they can keep trying with those experimentations, and more power to them for doing so.
Well, sure. What was obscure to one generation is now the new normal for a new generation. I wanted to say, a few words. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go.
I wanted to say a few words in a completely different area. We have to talk a little bit about Scott MacLeod and how influential he was back in 1993, understanding comics. Yeah. And he's still influential today, because I know I get down into the weeds, and I know linguistics people are still referring to Scott MacLeod. I know that people teaching comics, they refer to him, that the transitions within panels, his talking about comics being a language and a grammar. What can you say about Scott?
Well, I think MacLeod, who I know personally, I should say, but I'm a huge admirer of his. I think he had 3 different remarkable innovations, of which the one that you're talking about, understanding comics, I think was the second and sort of central. The first was his own work as a cartoonist, and I actually think for those people who have not read Zot, which he did first, I think it is really a wonderful comic, and it tries to do a lot of different things. Again, MacLeod was one of these people who picked up on manga early, apropos of our earlier conversation. He is someone who really kind of used his comic to tell all sorts of stories, and not just sort of visual dynamism, of which there is plenty, but also sort of real emotional, kind of sweet stories. And I talk about Zot some in the book, and I advise people to check it out. Second, of course, and maybe most monumentally, is as a theorist of comics, and being able, and this is no small thing, to do this in a form, in the comics form, that allows you to sort of really see the kinds of things that he's talking about in a fundamental way. And we use, Paul and I use Understanding Comics, as I think many other people do, in our class, to make sure that people sort of have the basic grammar and language of sort of of understanding comics. And the third act, of course, sort of right after that, was MacLeod's role as a visionary of comics on the internet. And he was an internet evangelist before a lot of people were. And obviously, like we've been saying before, this medium developed in ways not necessarily that he predicted, and not only in ways that he predicted, and all of that. But it's certainly the case that very early on he said, in a time when most people were not, this is going to transform the medium. This is going to transform this as a creative medium, and it's going to transform this as who is going to be doing it. And I think that is, that has been proven without a question that it's enormously transformative.
Well, he's definitely spot on about the idea of comics being on the web, because that is maybe the best way to introduce something to the public. If you're completely unknown and you don't want to be alone, you just start introducing your comic one after the other on a dedicated website or on your Instagram. As far as some of the more involved theories of Scott's about how we are going to enter into interactive comics, that is yet to be seen. So that'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 10 years or so.
One of the things I love, and I think you're right. And one of the things I love, doing in the book, is also trying as much as you can. You can't do everything, but to tell the story of some of these things that didn't work out, as well as the things that did. Right? We sometimes, as cultural historians, you say, okay, you want to make sure that you let your audience know it could have gone another way. So the most famous example of this is, the experiment with 3D comics, right, in 1952, right? Was this going to be the future of comics? Is that everyone was going to read them constantly through, red and green lenses, right? And of course that didn't. But, with the internet, all sorts of things were tried, are being tried, haven't tried, whether it's, are we going to read them on our phones one panel at a time? Are we going to now, subscribe to people's newsletters and then sort of read comics that way? Everything, lots of stuff is being thrown at us. And I think you're 100% right to say we don't really know what exactly is going to shake out of it. But the one thing I think that there's no question that has and will shake out of it is exactly what you said, which is this democratization effect. Really, anybody can put their comics on the web now. And if that person catches on and 10 million people groove to this person's comics, people are going to notice, and that's going to matter. And that person could live in Kuala Lumpur. That person could live, in the Midwest. It doesn't matter in a fundamental way. And I think that's amazing because, for all sorts of reasons, that was not the case, obviously, for most of comics history. You had to be in a very small set of geographic locations in order to be part of the conversation. And it's just not the case anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Every connection you made in comics, say in the 80s, was hard won.
Right.
Even discovering certain material. I had to actually make my first trip to Paris, my only trip until recently. I got to relive my glory days when I was in my mid-20s. I got to do that recently again, and boy, but that's going off into a tangent. But I had to actually go overseas before I could really look at Tardy and Blutch and some of these French comics that I just wasn't aware of them at home. Yeah. But I want to, you've been so generous with your time, but I want to share with you one last thing. My experience in actually beginning this book, I went to chapter 8 because I saw Seattle. I'm a cartoonist and I've been involved in comics since I was a little kid. And in college, I did comic strip, but it was in the 90s, in the early aughts, that I started to really get more into, well, let's see what I can actually do. I've been doing little projects. I'm gonna do mini comics, etc. So I got to know everybody from that area. And when you talk about Seattle, of course, you're talking about Fantagraphics. You're talking about Peter Bagg and Weirdo. So Seattle is definitely prominent. And I think of our Gen X sensibilities. And it comes back to one little question I have for you. How did Jennifer Daydreamer get on your radar?
You know, we had I think this might have been before we started recording, but you mentioned Karen Green,
Yeah.
and who's Columbia's graphic novels and comics librarian. And so, you know, one of the things that I did was very prominently was work with Karen in terms of this remarkable collection that she's assembled at Columbia. And Jennifer Daydreamers, I don't know her, but her work was part of this. And I really just said, wow, this is a piece of work that I really admire, and I wanted to make sure was represented. So the combination between sort of Karen's collection, a lot of the stuff mentioned in the press, so particularly the Comics Journal over the years, you know. But if I can give sort of a little bit of a megaphone to people who really deserve it, I'm delighted if that helps.
Oh, well, that's so nice to hear. Full disclosure, Jennifer and I have been together for many years, going back to the early aughts. So
Oh,
the
okay.
two of us have stories we could tell. We've seen so much, and so Chapter 8 brought me back, and I thought, well, I want more of this. I want more of this. Yeah, but yeah, living in Seattle, being around all these people, a lot of it we kind of take for granted, like it's just our lives, and people are people, but it's also very lot of cherished memories, and just the book, your book is such a delight on so many levels. And so I'm speaking to you from my perspective, and everyone's going to have their own story to tell.
Well, that I mean, coming from someone who really knows like you, I mean that's really a compliment that I take to heart. So thank you so much for these really kind words and for this wonderful interview. Thank you. I mean,
Well, you bet.
great.
Thank you, Jeremy.